Welcome to the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. I'm your host, Desiree Stanley, here to share some amazing conversations. We're talking business, health, making and saving money, or starting something epic. Think of this as your go-to spot for stories that do a lot more than just kill time. They spark ideas, give you a boost, and perhaps even change the way you look at the world. I'm pulling in the experts, the thinkers, the doers, and the dreamers. We're about to dive into stories that open doors and ideas that light up your brain. Here we go. Welcome, everyone, to the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. I'm your host, Desiree Stanley, and with me today is my guest, Danita Cummins. How are you today, Danita?
I am well. How are you?
I am fantastic. And we talked very briefly before we began recording, and as we're recording this, there was a natural disaster that went through North Carolina. By the time this episode airs, it will be a couple months later, but we both very deeply feel the tragedy that has occurred there. And the conversation that we had was very deep. And so to begin this conversation now, I think we're going to touch on some very important things in terms of faith and helping and some of those things. But just let me
Yes.
introduce you. Danita, you are the founder of Cummins Consulting, and you are a defense consultant. You are a faith-driven leader. You are a veteran. You are a founder of a nonprofit. And so really our conversation, I think, rolls from where we started before recording and
Mm.
really is going to get into how faith is such an important part of your life. And this is a lot of what our topic is going to be. So thank you for joining us. And I am excited to have this conversation with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is super exciting. Thank you for sharing space with me. That's very kind.
Wonderful. Well, Danita, I always love to have my guests share how this journey came to be for them. And I did mention a few of the things that you do now, but what was the path like for you?
It's funny. I was sharing recently with a friend of mine. We were talking and a new person that I'd met. So same question, like, how did you get to where you are today? You try to sum up 40 years of life, in like in a 30-second kind of summary. And I was sharing some of the stories and pieces, and my friend was sitting next to me and she laughed at one point. She said, "You keep saying that you didn't know where else to go. So you tried something new and you didn't have any other option. So you had to keep moving forward." And so I kind of laughed at that. But it was really, I grew up in Oklahoma. So I'm originally from Oklahoma, joined the military straight out of high school when I was 18 and went off, joined the Air Force and was a radio communications specialist. So I spent time, almost 9 years active duty in the Air Force, marriage, divorce, children, 9/11, all the really hard, crazy things that happened in that era. And then I got out of the Air Force in 2004 and worked as a defense contractor for several years, mostly because at the time, my husband was still active duty in the military. And at the time, we had 4 children. So I worked as a defense contractor for several years and a military spouse. And so that lifestyle, you kind of pick up and put down the things that you need at the time. So my career evolved really more out of necessity than out of like strategy. People ask me sometimes now with coaching and mentoring or consulting, how did you build this career? But it was really just when one door closed, another one opened. So there's a degree of insecurity and fear in that space, but not by an intricate, planned approach. We ended up here in North Carolina in 2011 through some experiences that I had in my past and some personal challenges that I had. I started serving in ministry and was also working in bivocational ministry. And eventually in 2016 decided that we were going to take the ministry work that we were doing that was underneath a local church and create a nonprofit out of it. And so that really came from the necessity of not having the resources to provide to the community what they needed. We have a crisis pregnancy outreach center. We started that, and that's been an evolution of things as well, so it's kind of like you go in and you're like, hey, we need these resources. We need $50,000 to run an outreach center. We need dedicated staff. And the small church wasn't able to provide those resources. After a conversation with the senior pastor, it was like, hey, we need to be a nonprofit. And so again, the door closed. So we're like, well, let's go find a new door. So I've been in bivocational ministry now for about 13 years, and I lead that organization and was still working, still serving for the Department of Defense, still working as a defense contractor and then as a Department of Army civilian. I came in and became a GS and spent some years there doing that, working in acquisitions and capability development, working with the special operations community, a lot on technology development. That's really where my focus was for the intelligence community and different agencies. I learned a lot about appropriations and the defense budget and how to do federal contracts and all those boring things. And then decided during COVID that I was kind of in the same place as a lot of people, I think, in that great reset, as we say. We weren't really sure what the next step was for me. I took retirement, deferred retirement from the Department of Army and went to work in industry. So I was in industry then again, working in aerospace defense as a director. And then, like many other people, I was laid off during COVID, kind of no notice as the companies were reorging, as many companies did. I was the new person in the company. And so my position was eliminated. And literally with 15 minutes notice, I lost my job. And so at that point, I had no job and no plan for a job and had already retired from the government at that point, wasn't going to go back into the government space. And so my husband and I had a series of conversations, of course, and crying. And it was like, well, now it's kind of now or never. I felt like I wanted to do something different and I wanted to do something new. So we both talked about it. I have an amazing business coach. That's my huge kudos to coaching. So she was a huge catalyst in helping me say, no, you can do this. You do have something to offer the world. And so don't be afraid to try. And so I launched Cummins Consulting Group in August of 2021. We really started in the beginning more so with strategic planning and defense consulting. And we've really kind of anchored there. So a lot of our clients that we have currently are still in that defense tech space. So I do a lot of coaching and consulting, more so consulting for organizational growth and design for leaders who are trying to enter into the defense ecosystem or they're in a place where they want to grow. And so I do a lot of consulting with small to medium-sized businesses in that space. But I started coaching business owners and a lot of solo entrepreneurs, or even in mostly in the technology space as well, just helping them with their business ideas, with launching new products or services. How do they get it out into the marketplace? Or is it really even a good idea to start, So I do both of those things now. That's what Cummins Consulting Group does. We work in those kind of two areas. And I tell people, if you are a manufacturing firm or if you work in textiles, we are probably not the company for you. Don't call us because we're probably not going to be the best advocate and asset for you. But if you're working in defense technology or in that technology space, telecommunications, C5ISR, software development, anything in that space, that's kind of where our 30 years of experience lies. And also on the organizational growth and leadership coaching piece. And so that's really kind of how I came to be here. And then a couple of years into that space, I launched my podcast, which I think we'll talk a little bit more later. But I launched the Interested to Lead podcast because I was having these phenomenal conversations with all of these government officials and leaders, military leaders, right? But then I'm also in the nonprofit ministry space. So I'm listening to them with their challenges and private sector, small business owners. And so it was just an opportunity to bring this conversation together because they're normally very segregated conversations. So the Entrusted to Lead podcast is what I like to say is kind of the conduit to bring all that together so that these people can share about their leadership experiences, the challenges that they have in their life and their careers, and hopefully help all of us grow.
Oh gosh, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I love that people always say, well, how do I condense this down to just this little blip of information when we're talking about such a span of time?
Yeah.
But thank you for sharing all the detail because it really just shows that we can transition to other areas. We can take the skills we have and translate them in a different way and use them in a different way. It's not that they don't count anymore, they're not good
That's right.
anymore. We can carry those forward and use them to take us in a new direction. And so I think that's such a great reminder not to say, well, I'm not good for anything because I can't do that anymore. And it's like,
Right.
no. Like, how can we take what we know and the experiences that we've had and use them in a new way? And so I think that that's really your story is how you've done that.
Yeah.
And I mean, really the logistics and all of the coordination and all of that stuff, I think is what makes you so good now at helping others
Oh,
to be able to do that. Yeah.
yeah, that's so helpful. No, I have this great heart for having that growth mindset, right? We talk about that growth mindset first, that's fixed mindset. And we're working through like a really hard problem in our pregnancy center now trying to grow because we're scaling, which is what I do as a coach and consultant, helping organizations scale. But even inside my own bubble, it's hard to see the other options, right? Like this creative mindset because we get so focused, like our brain just kind of goes to this tunneling and all the other options are blocked out and we only see this one or two thing that an option on the table and there are always so many more options. But we really do, I think the catalyst for me has been having that outside perspective because if I'm left to my own devices, I will be literally sitting in my chair like crying like I can't do it. It's all falling apart. And that still happens some days, but I have had these just great mentors and people come alongside and they see it in a way that you don't see it. They see your gifting or they see the opportunity when you don't see it yourself. And so valuable, I think, because you're right. You can say, I lost my job, or my spouse passed away, or I've had a disability. Now something happened. Like we've had all these real things happen in our life to family or to friends or ourselves. And it's just been this constant reminder of like, no, 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 that's not the end of the road. It just means that you're going to have to change your perspective. You're going to have to phone a friend. You're going to have to find somebody to help you. Yeah. So that's kind of what I try to teach now. Like there's another option on the table. We just need to step back and take the time to let it emerge.
You're so right. 100% agree. We do get into that blinders mode, and
Yeah,
it's like we just can't see what's right on the other side.
that's
And
right.
I'm pointing for the listeners, I'm pointing on the outside of my hands. But when we have an opportunity to work with somebody else, and even if it's just a friend, and I've
Mhm.
shared this before, when you've got somebody who is in a different industry or totally completely outside of the problem, they can see it in a different light and give you feedback on how you might come out of whatever it is that you're struggling through. And so I think that's
Yeah,
such a great reminder. And I absolutely agree with you. If we just take the time to maybe talk with someone, get a mentor, even a friend who's outside of the problem, they can help
yeah.
us work through it.
Yes.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I agree too. We do that a lot in coaching and mentoring and consulting too. I say that are we when there's a grieving process, which I think we skip over,
Mhm.
right? Even like we talked about before with the things that have happened in North Carolina and or in Maui or these other places, right? These tragedies that have happened recently in our lives. We don't, I think as humans, we've lost the ability to hold space for grief and to really kind of honor it and to honor those feelings. And so I think that was a big part of my journey. If I look back, there were years where I was resentful for a large period of time when this door closed, especially was it when it was not of my own doing, when I felt like it had been done to me. And there was a great just resentfulness and hurt and things. And in order to move forward, you've got to deal with those things. We try to stuff them in a closet and lock them in the closet, but they're coming out, whether we like it or not. And so I think that's the space that I try to hold now for like clients. There's great books about leading change and how you do that effectively, but there's the grieving process too of just acknowledging it and letting it be. I have a great friend who is a therapist, and she taught me years ago that every feeling is valid. And I use that more on my coaching and consulting probably than I do in my nonprofit work because we don't talk about that in industry at work. We don't talk about intimacy or transparent, this vulnerability. I'm feeling vulnerable. And so that's a big part of it too. I think it's just letting yourself feel the feelings and not judging them, but also letting yourself grieve the loss because it's real and walk through that and then get back up and keep moving forward.
Yeah, that's an excellent point for sure. Is taking the time that we need to process through that because we might be angry
Yeah,
if it's a job that we lost without having any notice, as
that's
you
right.
know happened for you, and or frustrated or whatever feelings it might be, and real concern. Like if you need a job to pay your bills, there's
That's
real
right.
concern there. And so when that kind of thing happens, remembering to take the time to process through all that is going to help you move forward a little bit better, I think. It's a
For
great
sure.
point. One of the things that we haven't touched on yet is in all of the things you've done, you've also written a book. And
Yes.
and I want to dive into this right now if we could. It's promise over purpose. And some of the things that we've been talking about is finding the door that's open for the door that's closed. Now, where do you go? And a lot of us are struggling to find what we should be doing that's suits our purpose, like solve some problem or fit some niche or whatever. And so your
Yeah.
book is really about how we need to be looking at this word promise over the word purpose. And
Right.
so tell us about your book, about what this means, and your kind of definition of promise versus purpose.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So I have, like I said, worked in ministry, bivocational ministry for 13 years. I've worked with different agencies, organizations. And there's this common theme, like you said, every time I get a new coaching or client or consulting client, or I'm talking with a founder or someone who started a company, we always go back to purpose, right? Which is just a normal human question. We all ask, what is my purpose? At some point in
Mhm.
our life, we're going to ask it. And I think we're asking it a lot, like big, what is my purpose? Like, why am I here? Like, why did I get put on this earth in this time and space continuum, right now? And then there's these micro purpose questions that we ask across our entire season of our lives, right? Like in different seasons, like when we lose someone, right? What was the purpose of the pain? Or when we have a job loss, or, there's so many different times in our life where we're asking, what is the purpose of this thing? Even though we might not know that we're asking that same question. And so I've spent years with people, and these questions keep coming up. What is my purpose? What is my purpose? And it really kind of came to catalyst for writing the book whenever we're leading youth group. My husband and I were leading our youth ministry for a while. I sat around the table one night and I had a young 15-year-old freshman. She looked at me one night and I was like, how are things going? What do you got going on? And she said, I don't know my purpose. And I looked at her and I thought, what? You're 15. What is happening? She was so wrought with anxiety. I didn't know it as anxiety at the time, but I just looked at her with this. I was like, that's what is going on. You don't carry that. But I looked around the room and the other girls all seemed to carry it as well. And they were all nodding at her in this silent agreement, like they were defeated, like they had failed somehow because they couldn't find their purpose. And it just, in a moment's notice, and I said, that's not what God called you to carry, right? I was like, the scriptures are very clear. God tells us to love him with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And it will take you a lifetime to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. It'll take you a lifetime. You're never going to get to the end of that rainbow. And then he tells you to love your neighbor as yourself, and you can do that in a billion different ways. And in every single moment of your life, there's a way to love him and love somebody else. So don't carry this. There are going to be so many times you're going to walk out the door and life is going to knock you down. There are going to be so many things where something's going to change. Your job will change. Your career will change. Your role as a wife or mother or a parent or not a parent. You know what I mean? There's so many stories I have. You may get cancer. You may not get cancer. There's 1,000 things that are going to come that we have no control. We don't see. But God sees, right? Like he is sovereign. Like he has a plan. He has a purpose. So my heart was just overwhelmed. So I went home. I spent a series of days and weeks praying about it and was just really like, what is the purpose? I mean, I'm not the first person to ask this question. We all ask it. And I just sat in this space of really trying to study from a psychology and a theology perspective, Christian theology perspective. What does the Bible say about purpose? And is it a lost Easter egg we're all supposed to chase and find? Is that what we're supposed to do? It's hidden at the end of the rainbow and we're supposed to get to the pot of gold and our job is to go find it, right? So we've launched this quest for purpose today in this time and space. And it wasn't like that. I don't remember when I was little. When I was young, I don't remember being told I needed to go find my purpose, find it, find it, find it. And I don't remember having the purpose anxiety when I was younger. But as I've gotten older, I do see it a lot in our culture and in our language and in our writings. And so that was kind of where the book started. It was just a discovery journey for me to try to figure out, what does the Bible say about purpose? And is it my purpose or is it God's purpose? And what does the theology say, right? And is that even something I'm responsible for, right, as a person of faith? And then studied the psychology of it. And then really got to this place where I came back to this one verse that says in Jeremiah 31:3, where it says, I have loved you with an everlasting love, which is a promise that God gives to us. It says, I will never leave you. I will love you forever. No matter what happens out there or even in here, I will always love you. And so I was like, well, if that one promise is true, right? That's the one promise I've held on to for, all these years with all these hard things. Are there other promises that God has given us that we can hold on to? And the answer is abundantly yes. So through my research, there are over 8,810 promises. And so I started to go through this place where I was like, we're chasing after purpose like it's a lost treasure. But God has given us all these promises that are very clear. Promises like ambiguous. It's almost like this weird, it's just hard to quantify. You can't always put it in a box. But promises, they're very clear. Like God is very clear about the promises. And so that's really the premise behind the book is there is a purpose that God has, a divine purpose that is sovereign in him, right? God is sovereign. And we are not always going to get to the end of the purpose. What is my purpose answer? We may ask it our whole lives and we may find out that we get to the end of the purpose rainbow and we still don't have an answer this side of heaven. Like that might really happen. But alternatively, he's given us thousands of promises every single day where he's like, hold on to this promise. Like in this promise, I will give you comfort. In this promise, I will give you wisdom. In this promise, I will give you strength. And so that's really the book, is the study of the psychology and theology. But the premise is like, if we were to change our focus and to stop chasing after purpose, like it's a lost treasure to be found, we would release this purpose anxiety that we hold on to, right? And we would come to this place of what we are all seeking is peace, whether we say it out loud or not, right? Just this comfort, like you're saying, this peace of knowing that I'm being a good steward, that my life has value, right? That like when I get up today, I'm making a difference and it matters to somebody else. And I don't need to build a big dynasty or empire, but I do need to know for myself that my time, talents, and treasures are valued by someone else. And we can do that by hanging on to the promises and letting those be our guideposts. And so if you live in God's promises every day, you do get peace. You do get sovereign strength. You do get divine wisdom and all of the promises that he's given us. It just looks different than where we live today.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. That was wonderful. And, I think the idea of finding our purpose, and it is happening younger and younger. And I remember as a child, though, people asking me, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And
Yeah.
that I think was the question of the time. Whereas now it's like, well, what's your purpose? Right.
Mhm.
For us, it was probably like,
So true.
what do you want to be when you grow up? And it was like, if you didn't know that as a child and you spent the rest of your life like struggling with that, well, what am I supposed to be when I grow up?
Mhm.
And so I think this is kind of how the terminology is now. It's like, what's your purpose? And it's sort of the language around how we're talking about it today versus what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah.
But it's the same thing. It still puts us on this quest, this journey of, well, what am I supposed to do? And then you follow a path and you think it's the right one. And then it turns out it's not later down the line. And you're like, well, what was that point of that? Why did I spend all these years doing that? And so I love the way that you have put this in terms of it doesn't have to be chasing something or trying to find something. If you're holding on to these promises, or if reading the Bible and verses and that is not your thing, what is your thing? What can you hold on to that's something higher than you that is
Mhm.
saying everything's going to be okay? Like you don't have
Right.
to be striving and pushing and whatever all the
Mm.
time.
That's
But
exactly true.
yeah, I love this idea though.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
And I think you're right because I think I have in this recent season of my life, the last say 5 years maybe, lost a lot of people in our lives. Last year, four family members passed away in 1 year. So last year was really hard. This year, we've lost really good friends. I have a dear friend who just passed away this summer from stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. She was 38. She left her 2 young children and her husband. And it's caused me to just ask these questions that are a little bit bigger and a little harder, and I've sat and watched people get to the end of their life, literally, the end of their life. And it was an interesting conversation. I got to the point where I was like, she doesn't care about vitamins and she's not asking these questions. She actually doesn't even care about leftovers, what's in the fridge or laundry or any of those things. Laundry's for the humans that are left behind. So are vitamins and leftovers. And it's just this moment where I was just like, man, what are we doing? And when you get to the end of all the things, I think we will all have some version of those kind of questions, whatever your faith is or your belief system or higher power or not. But I do believe that for the large majority of us, we will get to that place where we have these questions if we have the chance to reflect. And I think it is important because I think if we were to really sit down, back to the grieving comment, like, and take just 5 minutes and really say, what do I believe? What do I value? And we don't do that really as people. We don't really, have a strategic planning session for ourselves. I like to say, like, what's my values system and what do I really hold to be true? And what do I really value for myself, my truth? And then what do I want this life to be about? We don't get the chance because food, clothing, shelter is a real deal. You got a food, clothing, shelter. But I think we owe that to ourselves, to honor ourselves, to hold space for what that is. And part of that, I think, is this conversation about purpose. And when you do that, when you get to go through that, when you do hold space for that, when you value yourself enough to hold space for those things and have those conversations and ask yourself those hard questions and do the hard work, you do find peace. Because then when all the things are coming at you, all the things are coming, it's very easy or it's easier for you to say, nope, that's not for me. Nope, I'm not doing that. I'm going over here. Like business leaders, I say that a lot when I'm doing coaching and consulting. If you say your vision and your mission and your values as your company are this and this, then we have to be able to measure that or try to determine how to measure it so that we can be effective with our time and our resources. And then if you're not providing the value or the mission or you can't quantify it, then how do you know if you ever got there or if you didn't? So that takes time and intention. And we like to do it as organizational leaders, right? We like to do Q4, Q3, strategic plan, revenue, mapping. We do that all day long. We spend hundreds of hours. But do we do that for ourselves as humans? Most of the time, no, we don't. And then we wonder why we're frustrated or overwhelmed. Yeah, I agree with you. You don't, from this perspective, the book is obviously written from a Christian perspective. That's my perspective in the study that I've done. But I agree with you too. I think we need to define what do we value and ask ourselves those questions. So yeah, that
Yeah.
was good. Yeah, that was a good point.
Danita, I think you're so right, though. When you're sharing about taking time to reflect on what is truly important to us so that it can help us also just brush away those things that we don't need to be bothered with. It's like, yes, in our business, this is important. We absolutely need to be determining the direction that we want to go. Does this fit? And so putting that in our personal lives is just as important. Does
Hmm.
this fit in with what is important to me, what I value, the truths that I hold? If it doesn't, then I don't even need to consider it and move on. It's not
Right.
the direction I need to go. And so I think it's a great reminder to take the time and value ourselves enough to do that because we can get very we've got this thing to get to. I've got work and you've got events and school plays and practices and whatever
Yeah.
is going on in your life. And it's very easy to allow those things to just completely overwhelm you. But remembering to take time to think about what's really important it is so important.
It is. Yeah. And I think that goes back to like some of the other guests you've had I've on the show about when you talk about emotional intelligence and so how important that is. And I think they're connected. Like when we have this feeling of resentment or we haven't really listened to our true self, like we haven't given our heart the space, we haven't really sat down and said, what do I believe or how do I feel or what do I need or what brings me joy or what would bring me peace? Like how do I define that for me? Is my peace maybe different, right, than what you need or what you find valued? We just kind of stuff all that stuff in like we talked about. And then you go to work and you're irritated and frustrated and then there's a resentfulness or bitterness that builds and we don't really know. It's probably not the spreadsheets that you're doing every day that are causing this tension. It could be. You might not like spreadsheets, so that's fair. But I think for the majority of us today, in this century with work and it's we have deeper like kind of things going on. And when we don't take the time to really consider that, what do I value? What are the things that are important to me? What kind of life do I want to have? Or at least what are the things that I can hold as important in this time and space? Because we have true disabilities and we have ailing parents, like you said, and life doesn't always hand us good things. I just think that we kind of skip over those hard things. And then that's what causes us that like tension at the end of the day. But we don't really know it to be that. So I say that a lot to people who are in the position where they're like, I don't want to be in this when I do coaching or business coaching. And I do like when leadership coaching, when we talk about, I want to start a new job or I need to get a new job or whatever the thing is. And there's a tension there. That's one of the conversations. Like, do you know why you have the tension? Is it your boss? Maybe, right? It could be a toxic work environment. That's not okay. But if that's not the case, have you really taken the time to get underneath the surface to figure out what is going on? Because if you don't do that, you just leave one job and go to the next job and go to the next job. And then the next thing you know, you're still unhappy. We don't know why. So I think it's all connected, kind of us just taking time for ourselves.
Yeah, for sure. And I know there's an expression about, well, if you're unhappy in this place that you're in and you move somewhere else, just because you've gone to a different place doesn't mean you're now suddenly not going to be unhappy. You're
That's
just
right.
now in a different place. You just have different scenery around you. So, like your example, you're in a new job, but you're still unhappy. It's not the job necessarily. It's really what's happening inside you. It's
Yeah.
you that you need to be looking at to see what's happening in my life that I need to really reflect on, make changes, whatever the case may be, before jumping to a new place or a new job or a new relationship or whatever.
Right.
I
Right.
mean, there's so many we think it's the outside that needs to change for the
Mhm.
inside to change, and I really feel like it's reverse. It's we need to be looking at what ourselves,
Like,
and then the
yeah.
outside will change.
Like the 80/20 when we talk about having a new fitness when I'm going to lose weight and they're like, it's 80% what you eat and 20% working out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Same. Yeah. I think it's very much the 80/20 rule. Yeah. And there's a time and place. I mean, I'm a huge advocate for like there's certain abuse, harassment, not okay. No, like, you know, and I have a great heart and empathy for people who are in that position where they're working in a space and they feel trapped, right? That's a
Mhm.
real thing too. Like, so I'm not stepping over that. Like, oh, it's not a big deal. You just need a journal. Like, no, I mean, that's a real thing. But I do think that we're our hearts deserve a lot more, I think, than we give them sometimes.
Yeah, of course, and that wasn't to say that there aren't real situations that you absolutely need to leave. For sure, I wanna recognize that as pointed out, for sure, there are real cases. This is when you're just like the frustration or the unhappiness or whatever in just kind of the superficially sort of
Mhm.
things. And it's what's happening here that I feel like I want to leave.
Mhm.
Those are the things that I'm saying address maybe
Yeah.
internally.
Yeah.
So,
The restlessness, I think that's what my husband says. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, and that happens too, right? It's like, kind of going back to the purpose point, and you sort of are wondering, is this all there is? Like this job
Mhm.
where I'm just doing Excel sheets all day. Is this all there is to this life? And yeah, I think those are interesting questions that only we can answer for ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I do think the other part, and I write about it in the book, is that we put a lot of our identity in our roles that we hold,
Mhm.
right? So there's a big section where I talk about identity and what identity is. And we do say that again, from the faith perspective, there's a lot of kind of cliche, I think, languages that we put out, but this is your purpose to do this thing or be this thing or do this. And I use some examples in the book, people on different careers paths, choosing a different career path and then still being frustrated, still being overwhelmed. And well, I did all this, but I still have this emptiness and I don't really know why, or I'm still frustrated or I'm still overwhelmed. But I think it does come back a lot to our identity and where we put value. And for me, in my experiences, and I had to go through this many times, but the role that I had would one day be gone in an instant, or I had to lay that role down and I had to start something new. And there is that grieving process too. But if you put your identity and your self-worth and value in all those roles or titles, I say badges that we wear because in the military we always have a badge around our neck, then there will be a day where that will end. Like nothing is eternal forever in that respect. Jobs end, we retire, companies close, we have to move. And that's just one piece, right? Just our vocation. That's like the largest place where we give our fruits to the world, is what I say. That's the largest branch where we will offer our fruits to the world, other than our families. And that looks different for each of us. But there's such a big element of our purpose in our performance and our jobs and what we do every day. And when that ends, then we're left with that same question. So then you go back to, is it the right question to ask? Because you're like, well, my purpose is to do this. And then when that ends, what do you do? That didn't take away your value and your identity, but your identity and value are rooted underneath the thing that you do. And we struggle with that a lot in today. So I think that's another piece of it too, is just trying to like, sometimes we put a lot of weight in these things and they are good things. They're not bad things, right? We all want to make a difference in the world. But where is your identity? Where are you placing your value system? So
Yeah, that's fantastic. And thank you for sharing that point because I agree with you. We do always announce ourselves like, I'm a mom, I work this kind of job. And it's all of those kind of ways that we're labeling ourselves. And that's not all that we are. We are more than just that label. And so I completely agree with you there. And then, as you just said, sometimes you have to put that down
hmm
by choice or by because it just happened and
yeah.
pick up anew. And I think that to relate this to my experience, having grown children now that
Mm,
are independent, this
that's
idea
right.
of mother, being a mom, and I'm not, the role is not the same now that my children are grown as it was when they were little. And so for me, finding more parts of myself, who am I again, not having that mom role, quote unquote.
hmm
So it's
Yeah.
interesting. I think a lot of us can see ourselves in this in many ways. If it's not the mother role, it's the career role or whatever the case is for the listener.
hmm
But so great. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And we have hardly touched on so much of what we are going to be doing today. But let's just, I absolutely have to ask you because we've touched on some topics that have been difficult. And so you have a chapter that's the sanctity of suffering. And so if we could talk a little bit about that before we begin to get into closing out the show, I
Sure.
absolutely want to talk about this because we have been seeing some very difficult things happening these last few years. COVID, natural wildfires, fires in many places in the country,
hmm
weather patterns that have been just horrendous. We mentioned the what happened in North Carolina. And so let's talk a little bit about this chapter, if you would.
Sure. Okay. So when I was going through the purpose study, I guess, my own discovery journey, I kept coming back to this place where we need to find purpose in our pain, right? We say that all the time. And I say that through my own experiences, like I shared with friends who are struggling with cancer, or they've lost children, or they've lost spouses, or just big stuff and little stuff too, right? Suffering looks different for each one of us. But I kept coming back to this thing of like, we don't always get the answer to that. Like, what is the purpose? And I have good friends who lost to one of their children in a very traumatic accident. And I just sat, and it was like this theme over and over. And we see a lot of loss in the pregnancy help ministry as well. So there's a lot of hard things that we navigate through there. And it was like there has to be more than just the pain. And and in my own experiences of going through this great season of loss with the family members that we lost and my friend going through the cancer. And I just started to see this, like, it goes back to the promises, right? There's this promise that regardless of the suffering or the hurt that there is a promise that for me, my faith, right, that God will never leave me in my suffering. Like he says that. It's very clear, right, in the scriptures over and over and over. Not that the suffering will go away, not that it will all be removed, not that there'll be a pain-free life. I think our pastor recently just did a sermon where he talks about you don't come to a life of faith and then just get in the little raft and you just float around in this happy little life all day. It's like, life is like a roaring, raging rapids, and your raft's going to get flipped over and you're going to have to drag that sucker back up river sometimes. So it was just watching this great suffering and then asking the purpose question, because we all do, and expecting that I was going to get some pull the handle, right? And something was going to drop out of the little candy machine. And there was going to be an answer where God was going to say, oh, the baby died. This is why. Here's the purpose of your pain. And life doesn't work like that. I mean, it just doesn't. And we like to say, at least in the faith Christian circles, right? Our pain is to help someone else, right? So we think that we hope that one day the hurt or the hard stuff that we deal with will be there to help someone else. And I do think there's great value in that. But sometimes it's not what we're looking for. We don't always have to have a purpose in our pain so that it helps somebody else. It's great when that does happen. And I do think that there's a kind of supernatural sovereignty that it might happen. But then there's also still this heartache and this hurt that we have. And so I found this beautiful kind of, I call it the algorithm, this comfort algorithm where suffering is never absent the comfort of the Father. And so there is for those who suffer, right? And you see that a lot in kind of old language, old writing. Even you see it, like I was just talking about Mother Teresa's writings yesterday because I spent time reading her journals and writing. And for as much good as she did in the world, she had a long suffering. I mean, her writings are very melancholy, and she was just heartbroken a lot, and she felt absent or she felt unseen, and she just struggled with this heartache and these things because she was carrying such hard stuff. And we just we kind of skip over the hard stuff. And so the chapter is really about there is a sanctity in the suffering, and it's lonely, but there is a promise that God will never leave you. And it's a beautiful, intimate place. I think if you're willing to sit with him in your suffering, he promises to not leave us. He promises to always be there. He promises to hold us. He doesn't promise to make it go away. So that's hard. But for those of us and me and others that I know that have gone through really hard suffering places, if we're in the space where we are vulnerable enough to kind of lay things down and be like, I can't do it today. I have nothing left. Like bathroom floor moments. I write a lot about the bathroom floor moments in the book, just about the place of just, we're completely undone. We have nothing left. God meets us in that, in this powerful supernatural way that is just hard to explain. And so the offering is when we're out here looking for purpose in our performance or our identity and our suffering, that sometimes there's a comfort and there's a sanctity to it. There's a beauty, so don't miss that. Like, don't miss the beauty, in that space, while you're in the intimacy of it, while you are, going through some really hard times. And if it helps somebody else one day, that's a beautiful thing, For me, I was in a season and there was some really hard stuff in a scenario. And one night I was sharing this with, I was really upset about a really hard thing that had happened. And a good friend of mine that works at the ministry with me, she says, well, one day God will use it for his glory. And I was like, I really don't care about God's glory today because I'm hurt, because something really hard happened and it's people that I love. And so I'm not really concerned about his glory today. And it was this moment where I felt this like supernatural, just like this intimate moment where it was like, it's not about helping other people, Danita. It's about my heart. Do you see that my heart is broken too? Do you see that my heart is grieving too? Do you see it hurts me too? And I told her, I said, it's not about the others. It's about the Father's heart. And so that's kind of where I sit now on this other side of suffering.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's so powerful. And something that came to mind for me when you were talking about the bathroom floor moments, it's if you are in that position, sometimes it's that moment when we crack open, when our heart just absolutely cracks open, and we may have something revealed to us that helps us through that.
Right.
And maybe it does reveal something, and maybe it helps us realize that we had to go through that to come to a new level or a new place with new eyes, new understanding. And so I think that that's so powerful. And so thank you for sharing that. And I'm touched because I could feel, the sadness that you just shared in that moment. And so Thank you for that because it is powerful. And I think we need to not push that down, not push that away, not discount those moments just to get over it and get on to the next thing. I think it's too important that we go through those moments to get to where we need to be also.
Yeah.
And yeah, so thank you.
Yeah. Agree. Thank you. That
Yeah.
was very
Yeah.
kind. Thank you.
Oh, goodness. Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I've been so honored to have you on. I do want you to share your podcast again with us. It's Entrusted to Lead. And so if you would tell us again what it is that you're discussing on the show, you shared
Sure.
briefly, but if you want to tell us a little bit more and also when the episodes are released so that the listeners can check it out.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah. The Entrusted to Lead podcast is about the essence and elements of leadership. And my heart is really that we as leaders are entrusted with the care and safekeeping of others. And that's other than parenting, I think is probably the most important calling that we will have in our lives. And we should not take that lightly. And I think we dismiss our ability to lead ourselves and others through titles and positions, right? And so we discount our influence in the world always. And so that's kind of the first challenge. Like anywhere that you are in the world, you can lead someone else, right? Through whatever that is. So don't miss that, right? And the second piece is that we have a responsibility to lead ourselves and them well. And sometimes we skip over ourselves. So back to the conversation we had today. So the podcast is really designed around that conversation, is to equip and empower leaders so that they can lead themselves and others well. And so we have different conversations. The guests who come on, like I said, some of them are former military generals that I've worked with. They talk about their lens of leadership through different experiences that they've had. I do have ministry leaders who will come in or who serve in ministry. I have a lot of independent kind of solo entrepreneur coaches and consultants who come in and talk about their perspectives, different authors, if they have a new book. But it's all around kind of that lens of ourselves and our hearts. Like, how do we become better leaders? Emotional intelligence, communication, conflict resolution, like those things that are really hard, the things that we don't really know. There's not a checklist for. And then we also talk about kind of how that affects our organizations and how we can lead others. So it's a kind of melting pot conversation where we get everyone kind of around the different perspectives and they get to come and share. So it's not specifically a faith-based podcast. We do talk about faith sometimes, and then sometimes we don't. It's just this perspective, but it's really about from the leadership side, how can we grow and take care of ourselves and keep showing up every day, even when it hurts, because you matter. So it airs the first and third Thursday of every month. We're in season 3, which will be in 2025. It's going to be a little bit different format. We're hoping to have weekly episodes that'll air every week on Thursdays. So by the time the listeners hear this, we should be launching season 3. So that'll be super cool. But they can find us on all the platforms. So Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio. Yeah. And we have a YouTube channel. So there are all the platforms they can find us.
Amazing. That sounds incredible. Thank you for sharing the detail on that. And I love that you got those different perspectives on leadership, on life. And we are leaders, even if we don't have the title in a company or a corporation or whatever. And you're so right. We are leaders of ourselves, our families, our communities. I said it before on podcasts. I absolutely agree with you. So love it. I'll include all the details for the listeners to easily find the show. So definitely
Thank
want
you.
to suggest checking that out. Also, if there's any other podcasts that you want to share with the listeners, I'd love to have you make any recommendations now, or if there's books that you have found to be helpful or beneficial, if you want to share those with us, that'd be great.
Yeah, I love my kind of like place where I'm serving now. The podcasts I'm listening to are all about books. So if that helps any of your listeners that are launching a book or marketing a book or wanting to write a book. So I'm pretty much binge listening to all of the book marketing podcasts. Becky Robinson has the book marketing podcast. So I love that. Weaving Influence is her company that she launched a few years ago. So that's my one big recommendation for book launch, book marketing. And then Thomas Umstead Jr. has a really great novel marketing podcast. Author Media is his brand. He's been in the world a long time. He has a wealth of knowledge. So if anybody's listening and they're interested in learning how to write a book, fiction or nonfiction, or self-publishing, traditional publishing, hybrid publishing, those two guys are my go-to podcasts right now. And then for books, I think some of my favorites, I'm spending a lot of time right now studying the personhood theology. So that might not be for the average listener, so I'm digging into a bunch of books about the personhood. But I would say that some of my favorites are Jordan Rayner, Redeeming Your Time. Jordan Rayner he writes a lot about work, right? Biblical work, the vocation of work. But he has a great book, Redeeming Your Time, which has a really great time management system in there. I use it and I recommend it all the time to my coaching clients, just about how to kind of get your arms around all the things we have to do every day. So I would say he's probably my number one favorite. And then I'm digging into a bunch of fiction books that have something to do with dragons or time travel or epic love stories. Anything that pops up on my Audible feed that has a dragon in it, I'm pretty much listening to also.
Oh my gosh, I love it. Thank you so much for those recommendations. Fantastic. And such a great variety too. So I love encouraging the listeners to check out something that might be different than they have thought about reading before and what that can do to open up your mind. So I
Sorry.
love it. Thank you for those recommendations. I'll
You're
include
welcome.
the details in the show notes.
Okay.
Lastly, Danita, if you would share with the listeners how they can find you, follow along the work you're doing, talk with you if they've got questions, where would you like to have them go?
Sure. Yeah. The best place is to pop over to my website. It's danitacummins.com. And I'm on Danita Cummins, all the socials, the same. But the website is the best because it links to my consulting website. So if you want to learn more about coaching and consulting services, there's links for that. There's obviously for the book. And I have an Entrusted to Lead newsletter. And the podcast is there. So you can pretty much grab all of the things. There's some strategic planning checklist freebies so that you can download to help you with your organizational growth planning. And then, of course, we have some bonus materials for the book as well. So yeah, check me out over there. Let me know if you need anything.
Wonderful. That's perfect. And I'll include the details again in the show notes. Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for your time. This has been wonderful and I so appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been great. Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. Well, we'll talk more soon.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in to another insightful episode of the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. We appreciate your time and curiosity as we explore fascinating topics together. If you enjoyed today's discussion, be sure to join us next week for another amazing episode. Remember, your journey of learning and growth is a continuous adventure, and we're thrilled to be part of it. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next week, stay curious and keep exploring those pockets of knowledge.